Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide shows the Live from NYPL logo in gold on a white background with the text, Live from NYPL presents, on Francis Bacon, Annalyn, Swan, and Mark Stevens with Fintan O'Toole, April 15th, 2021, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The second slide contains an image of the featured book jacket. The cover shows a close-up black and white photo portrait of Francis Bacon, who appears here as a middle-aged white man with medium-length salt and pepper hair brushed back from his face. He is wearing a ribbed turtleneck and leather jacket and gazing into the camera with a serious expression. On the left, there is a narrow vertical image running along the spine of the book that shows a glimpse of an artist's studio with paintbrushes in a bowl on a table. The text of the cover reads, Francis Bacon, Revelations, Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan, Pulitzer Prize-winning authors of De Kooning. Francis Bacon Revelations is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us at Live from NYPL. My name is Faye Rosenfeld. I'm the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library, and I have the great privilege of introducing our guests, Annalyn Swan, Mark Stevens, and Fintan O'Toole. They're here to talk about Annalyn and Mark's monumental new biography of the artist Francis Bacon, entitled Francis Bacon, Revelations. Acclaimed by reviewers as mesmerizing, definitive, and a captivating triumph, among many other superlatives, the book is the product of over a decade of painstaking research. It follows on the heels of their earlier biography of another towering figure of 20th century art, Willem de Kooning, a work for which they won the Pulitzer Prize. Both Annalyn and Mark have long associations with the New York Public Library. Mark was a fellow at our Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, and Annalyn serves on the library's Research Advisory Council. So it's a particular pleasure to have them back with us this evening to discuss the fruits of their research. And I want to say a special thank you to Fintan O'Toole for joining us all the way from Ireland to moderate this conversation. Fintan is, of course, an author, cultural critic, and political commentator. He's a regular contributor to the Irish Times as well as the New York Review of Books. If you have not yet purchased a copy of Francis Bacon Revelations, you can buy the book from the library shop. We're dropping a link for that right into the chat, and purchases made there benefit the New York Public Library. If you have a New York Public Library card, of course, you can also borrow a copy. You can find links for and information about all of this, as well as recommendations for further reading on tonight's event page at nypl.org/live. We have many more fantastic authors and guests joining us at Live in the weeks ahead. Way too many to list, so I'll just mention a couple of highlights. Next week, on Monday, April 19th at 8 p.m., we have another Pulitzer Prize winner and former Cullman Fellow, Louis Menand, speaking about his newest book, The Free World. He'll be in conversation with the New York Times' A.O. Scott. Later in April, as part of the library's World Literature Festival and in honor of National Poetry Month, we have an evening of readings, discussion, and music celebrating 1,000 years of Persian poetry by women. That's on April 29th. You can find all of these and much more listed on the Live from NYPL website, and we very much hope that you'll join us. We're going to get to the program in just a second. Before that, I have just a few quick housekeeping notes. First, I wanted to let you know that because of time differences, this conversation was pre-recorded, so we won't be able to take your questions tonight, but we'd love to hear from you. So please say hello in the chat, let us know where you're tuning in from, what you're reading, and any reactions you have to tonight's discussion. Second, a brief disclaimer. The library values your privacy very much, and in that spirit, and in the interest of transparency, we want you to know that while tonight's video and chat are viewable on the New York Public Library website, they are both, in fact, being hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share some data about yourself, which the library does not control. For more details about all of this, you can visit our FAQ, along with Google's privacy policy and the library's privacy policy, all available on the event page. Okay, that's all from me. And now, please enjoy the program.
Hello, everybody. My name is Fintan O'Toole, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event on behalf of the New York Public Library. And we're here over the next hour to celebrate the publication of an absolutely wonderful biography of the great painter Francis Bacon by Annalyn Swan and Mark Stevens. And just so we know what we're talking about, Annalyn and Mark are going to take us through some slides which will introduce us to Francis Bacon and to his work, and then we'll come back and have a conversation about the book.
Okay, so many biographies begin with a charming old photograph like this one. Here we see Francis Bacon as a boy with his arms thrown happily around the shoulders of his lovely Edwardian mother. He was born into great privilege, Bacon, as this photograph suggests, growing up in the Anglo-Irish world of the big houses around Dublin, where nothing was more interesting than a horse. But old photographs like this one often mislead. Bacon's early emotional and physical life was one of slow suffocation. The adult world of the big houses was suffused with fear of the Irish Revolution developing just beyond the door. His father was a cold-hearted, dyspeptic major, ashamed of his girly son. His mother was perfectly conventional. She even rode side saddle. And Francis himself was not only girly, but gravely ill, a desperate asthmatic child, allergic to horses. Next, please. Here you see two very different women who helped in their different ways to save Bacon's life. On his left is the robust Granny Supple with her third husband. She was a fabulously rich eccentric, not at all stuffy, who introduced the painfully shy boy into the world of parties and conversation. One could perform. Life could have a sparkle. On the right is Bacon's nanny, Nanny Lightfoot, who was not nearly as starchy as this image of a prim, bespectacled figure suggests. She was working class, mischievous, down to earth. She lived with Bacon until her death many decades later. Several other women also helped Bacon early in his life. Among them, when he was in his teenage years, the leading light of London fashion, Madge Garland, who wanted to make Bacon a great English modern designer. Next image, please.
So this is a result of Francis Bacon's tutelage by Madge Garland. This is a photograph of a show of his furniture and rugs in 1930 at his studio at 17 Queensberry Mews, London. There are tall panels, very modern furniture along the lines of Eileen Gray. And on the floor, more furniture, strikingly modern interior. This resulted in a wonderful presentation by Madge Garland, an article called The 1930 Look in Decoration that appeared in the Studio magazine, September 1930, the leading art and design magazine of the time in London. So Bacon at this point was off and running in his new career as a decorator. And he strove mightily to completely deep six this part of his life in later years because he didn't think, of course, it was grand enough to go with his career as an artist. But in fact, he was a designer for about 4 years. Next. This is another early success of Bacon's. It's a smallish crucifixion painted in 1933. It depicts a spectral white figure on a cross set against a black void. This early crucifixion of Bacon shows a decided debt to Picasso, whose Dinar series of elongated figures on the beach profoundly influenced him at the time. But as we write, while, quote, the stretched out limbs and tiny head of the Christ figure evoke Picasso's Dinar series, the X-ray ghostliness was something new. It reflected Bacon's interest in X-ray, spiritualist phenomena, and the concealed life. And it was included in the second show of a great new and fashionable Mayfair gallery, the Freddie Mayer Gallery. It was quite a triumph to be included in this show. Not only that, it appeared in a book by Herbert Reed, a very influential art critic and historian, in his book called Art Now. It was positioned across from a painting of a crucifixion by Picasso, no less. What an unbelievable start to this young artist. And then it was bought by Sir Michael Sadler, one of the great collectors of the time. One would have thought that now Bacon would go on to a marvelous art career, and then it all suddenly ended. Next.
This is 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion painted in 1944, about a decade after the crucifixion that you just saw, a decade in which Bacon truly suffered. He was very much a young artist in a garret, experiencing failure after failure. For each panel of this triptych, Bacon created, which was painted during the war, Bacon created a monstrous half-human figure. And behind each is a vile orange color, reminiscent of wartime fires, an orange that would scald the eyes of Londoners of the time who wanted nothing more at the end of the war than to enjoy a dim and cozy drawing room. The eyeless, toothy, gloating ghoul in the center panel with the bandage around his forehead was particularly shocking because he appears so strangely intimate, friendly, related, like a disagreeable relative or somebody who's about to slide down the bar and talk to you. In other words, the monster is not simply Germans, bad guys, soldiers, the quote unquote other. The monster is us, the human creature. We called the book Revelations for many reasons, but the most important is probably that Bacon, a very theatrical man, was always seeking the revelatory moment when the curtain is drawn back. Next image, please. This is my head. This is my head. Thankfully, it's not. This is head 1, 1948. We nicknamed it Mr. Hyde, as in Dr. Jekyll's more interesting aspect. In this painting, the face seems to slide off the great tradition of English portrait painting to reveal the rather poignant animal that lies behind the studied social performance found in traditional portraiture, in a photograph too, like the one that we just saw of Bacon and his mother. There is no line in English art more exquisitely taut, abstract, or painful, I think, than the one that's attached to the figure's ear there. It seems to release the face from the head. Next image, please.
So here we see Bacon's study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, a big painting of 1953 depicting a purple-robed Pope sitting on a regal throne of gold, but with his mouth open wide in a scream, while dark striated black lines flow from the top to the bottom of the painting, seeming to rain down some form of horror from the heavens above. This was the culmination of Bacon's first famous series of screaming popes of the early 1950s. We write that it is as if the Pope has seen not the Holy Father, but the devil himself. Bacon later disavowed his Pope paintings, but his friend and devoted critic David Sylvester noted how evocative they were of old master paintings. Sylvester wrote that 1953, the year that this sulfurous Pope was painted, was the end of Bacon's first grand period, that of his head series and his first Pope paintings. Next.
Bacon liked to pretend that he was invulnerable in his personal life to love, a frightening word to him. And when he used that word in conversation, he usually put it in implied scare quotes. But in the early 1950s, he fell head over heels in love with this man, Peter Lacy, who looks like a handsome English actor from the 1940s, whose name you can't quite remember. Their relationship has been, in earlier books, regularly caricatured as a kind of violent, lurid, absurdist, sadomasochistic folly. In fact, despite the violence, it was by far the most meaningful relationship in the lives of both men, and it ended only with Lacy's death in 1962. Next image, please. This is Two Figures, 1953. It shows two men having sex, almost certainly Bacon and Lacy, in a dark and beautifully blurry atmosphere. It's an iconic portrayal of homosexual passion. It could not be exhibited in 1953 when it was made. Lucian Freud, not himself homosexual, kept it over his bed until the end of his life. Freud certainly loved the paint handling and the composition, but he probably also appreciated the moody way the painting captures both ferocity and tenderness. Next image, please.
The 1960s were Bacon's portraiture decade, when he returned again and again to painting certain friends. This is a 1967 painting called Portrait of Isabel Rossthorne standing in a street in Soho. Rossthorne is portrayed as a commanding figure in black, framed within both a circle and a rectangular cage, two of Bacon's favorite ways of structuring a painting. She stares coolly at the action around her, a Bohemian duchess surveying her domain, as we write in the book. Although he is most celebrated for his paintings of men, Bacon chose to paint certain women multiple times. One of them was Isabel Rossthorne, whom he met in the late 1940s in Paris. She had been the lover of Giacometti and was a formidable and celebrated woman in literary and artistic circles on both sides of the English Channel. In all, Bacon painted 16 portraits of her, including this grand vision of the Bohemian duchess surveying her domain. Next slide, please. This black and white photograph of Francis Bacon and his lover of the time, George Dyer, shows them dressed for a night out on the town in the 1960s. The two met in 1963 when, according to one story, George, a petty thief from the East End of London, fell through the skylight of Bacon's studio at 7 Rees Mews. And Bacon, according to the story, promptly told him that he'd turn him in unless Dyer had sex with him on the spot. It was a great story, but alas untrue. The two actually met in a posh homosexual bar near Harrods. But Bacon did love the idea of socializing with tough East End thugs, as did many upper-class English of the time. The infamous Cray brothers, who ruled organized crime at the time in East London, knew and liked Bacon. Alas, George proved to be as inept a companion as he was a crook. He was bumbling and hapless, but he could sit still for hours as Bacon painted him. And he was marvelous looking, well-built, and with a commanding prow of a nose. Bacon liked to go out on the town with him in the 1960s. As we write about this photograph in the book, when Bacon and Dyer went out, they made an impression. Bacon carefully casual, Dyer in Edwardian-looking suits. Next. This is actually one of my favorite photographs in the book. It's of Francis Bacon at the grand dinner that followed his 1971 retrospective at the Grand Palais in Paris. This was like the apotheosis of, in many ways, of Bacon's career. He loved France. He sort of mounted a very subtle campaign to have a retrospective at the Grand Palais, where Picasso previously had his own enormous retrospective there. So Bacon's 134 painting strong show opened in November of 1971. Here he is at the dinner, at the Le Trembleu, glittering dinner afterwards. 500 people were there. He is smiling, standing, acknowledging the crowd. The backstory is that the night before, poor George, the hapless, bumbling George, had taken an overdose of drugs and alcohol in their hotel room, had died, was found dead on the loo the very morning of this grand retrospective's opening. So here was Francis Bacon, the consummate actor, maintaining his calm and his cool, graciously accepting all applause, and knowing, meanwhile, that his lover was sitting dead on the loo in their hotel. Next.
This is Triptych, August 1972, one of several triptychs Bacon painted after George Dyer's death. George was indeed bumbling, but he was also a sweet-souled character, and Bacon was absolutely devastated by his death. Together, the series of triptychs he painted around George's death represent a deep, varied, and sustained meditation on death, an unusual sort of enterprise in 20th century art. The triptychs have a distantly religious air, another reason for the title of the book, Revelations. Here in the two side panels, Dyer is seated and still alive. In the central panel, however, he has the sort of unstrung form of death. What's most striking about the central panel, the image of death, to me at least, is the cold violet pool that has drained from his body, that implacable violet, a color often used elsewhere, of course, to depict flowers. No heartbeat disturbs this cold violet pool. It's such a fresh sort of apprehension of death. Next image, please.
So here we have two self-portraits of Bacon. He began painting these small scale self-portraits about 14 by 12 inches in 1960 and turned increasingly to them in later years as his favorite subjects, always people he knew intimately, began to die. He always complained, oh, everybody's dead. I only am left with myself. Here we see his study for self-portrait of 1979 on the left and self-portrait of 1972 on the right, both set against Black backgrounds. Bacon's self-portraits often reflected his mood of the moment. The self-portrait of 1972 on the right is quietly contemplative, painted in the broad, swirling brushstrokes that he favored during this period. His eyes look down, his expression is peaceful. It is, as we say, a face losing itself in thought. In contrast, the study for self-portrait of 1979 on the left is a picture of crushing pathos, the haunting image of an aging queen, his eyes bloodshot, his lipstick smeared, his cheeks powdered. At the time, John Edwards, whom Bacon met and fell madly in love with in 1976, was showing Bacon that he would not finally be owned by him. Bacon was profoundly upset. In the painting, his haunted eyes stare to one side as we write, and the mask might fall at any moment and seeps into a heap of dust, powder, and rouge. Next.
Bacon is best known for his 20th century scream, but he was just as good at whispers, in fact, as those self-portraits indicate. This is his very last painting. He knew it was his last painting, we believe. It's his farewell to the ring, a picture of a dark, grayish bull set against a whitish rectangle and an almost empty field with just a horizon line suggesting the outer world. Like Picasso, Bacon enjoyed the ancient theater of the bullfight, but here he abstained from the use of bright theatrical colors. He mixed actual dust, the dust that all his life filled his asthmatic lungs, into these hushed colors. One horn of this annunciatory bull, who is surely bringing Bacon, one of the leading matadors of the 20th century, the news of his impending death. That horn is shaped like a scythe, an ancient symbol of mortality. And with that, I think we can conclude this little introduction.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure, like everybody watching, found that very illuminating and very, very moving. Obviously, we want to talk about Bacon's life and about his work, but I just wanted to start with the book in a way and confess that I found it vastly more enjoyable than I expected to. And it's because, of course, of the perception of Bacon, which is very well rooted in reality, of this darkness. And people can see in those images what that means. And yet the book is full of life and light and humor and energy. And I just wondered, Mark, how much of that did you and Annalyn bring to it as writers, and how much did you extract from Bacon's life and work?
Well, I think we were just describing what was there. In fact, he in order to be able to in art, in order to paint a good shadow, you have to really understand light, and that was very much what Bacon's life itself was like. Yes, he was a shadowed man, but it had pathos and power because he was so attracted to the light, to vivacity, to charm, to life, to a life that's not suffocated by asthma, that's free. So he had a brightness about him, a funniness, a wit, and an enjoyment, because he was always aware of the shadow of death. It made the light all the more powerful and appealing. And I think that was, Annalyn, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was why the book was not at all painful, except for the ordinary ways the books are painful to write. It was not painful to be with Bacon because he was so surprising and funny. And he said he woke up every day with an optimistic feeling about what might happen on that particular day.
Yes. Annalyn, one of the things that obviously as an Irish person absolutely fascinated me was I must confess again, to a sort of perception that Bacon was an English painter who happened to be born in Ireland. But I think one of the things you established so brilliantly in the book is this Anglo-Irish world, which is a sort of a liminal world. It's neither quite one thing or the other. And also, of course, a world that is somehow conscious of its own imminent demise. The death of this world is kind of written into its late existence, which of course produces this incredible flowering, not just in Bacon, but in so many other figures. But could you just talk to us, Annalyn, a little bit about that Anglo-Irish world and how you discovered it and how important you think it is to shaping Bacon's consciousness?
Well, we thought from the get-go, it was essential to go to Ireland and establish that identity. I mean, we had this sort of sixth sense that a lot of the Bacon character was formed in those early days, which of course turned out to be true. It was astonishing to us that people hadn't really gone and done what we call the boots on the ground research in England, in Ireland, because the big house culture was so very special, sort of this tiny little microcosm of English society that had established itself across the sea. So we very early on went and we retraced the steps and discovered the Curragh and spoke with people who had known his tutor in that one moment when he was tutored by Lionel Fletcher, this marvelous sort of parson who would take off his robes, get on his horse, and go hunt. So you have to understand that essential world, and also the world, the quality of sort of blood sacrifice of that world. Hunting was so big there. His parents would hunt 2 to 3 times a week. All of his family had been masters of the hounds at different times, and that surely this little lonely, isolated boy, who was left behind, but as the pack went baying off into the hither and yon, as we write. That had an enormous influence on him, as did the animals and the stables, the dung, everything else that was involved in being a life in the country at that time in Ireland. And all of that later plays into his art, that kind of sense of the tactile sense of animal, beast that you see throughout. Yes.
Mark, there's a word that you've used actually already a couple of times, which is suffocation, and obviously it refers to his asthma, which must have had huge psychological as well as physical effects, and in shaping him. But there's also a broader sense of suffocation, isn't there, in his early life?
Yes, he had the sense that the outer world beyond the door of the big house was very, very threatening and suffocating because of the brewing Irish Revolution, the whisperers, the people in the woods, the strange fires and lights that would appear. Must have been remarkably powerful to a child to experience that. But in addition to that, he had no strong relationship with either of his parents. His mother was kind and nice, but was much more involved with society and horses and hunting than with a little boy. His father was actively hostile to him. So his asthma meant he couldn't go out and join as Annalyn said, join the animals. He couldn't be in the barnyard. He couldn't be. We forget that Irish society of the big house then was not just the fancy balls. It was also this teeming animal world, very, very physical. Cows, ducks, geese. He couldn't do any of that. So that's why we call the first chapter Boy at the Window. He was separated and suffocated. But now if you're feeling suffocated, of course, you begin to love the idea of explosive release. And I think you see that begin to develop in his life.
Which leads us nicely, Annalyn, into his sexuality in a way, because as biographers, biographers are always in the prurience business to some extent, we and readers, we want to know. But in Bacon's case, it's impossible to separate his artistic development as a painter from his sexuality. You know, they're so deeply intertwined that even if you were to have made a decision, you know, to leave that aside, it would make no sense whatsoever.
No, it would be utterly impossible because as a, you know, at the point when other boys are off at school and sort of learning, you know, about life, there was little Francis Bacon sort of home alone. He only had a year and a half of education, leading a very kind of internal life. And the internal life was leading him inevitably towards, you know, his homosexual side. So there is no way that we could not begin to develop that theme very early in the book. It is his cousin Diana in the 1920s knew about this side of her cousin, although she didn't want to acknowledge it. But you know, the interesting part of this too is that Bacon never in his life hid his homosexuality, which is a fascinating theme that runs throughout the book. You know, in 1953, when he painted the painting that Mark showed earlier, the two figures, or the buggers as it was familiarly called, that was the year that Alan Turing, you know, the scientist, was, you know, had to undergo chemical, what do you call it, castration. It was very, very dangerous. Lord Montague, the famous case of Lord Montague, and he was sentenced to a year in prison because of having homosexual relations with some military men. At this particular moment, one would have thought that Bacon would go underground like most of the homosexuals at the time. And one essential fact about him is that he never did. He was very brave and he was open about it, you know, at a time when being open about it was really a very dangerous thing to do.
But, you know, oddly, he was open about it, but his sister didn't realize that he was homosexual until the 1970s. I mean, people were it just didn't occur to a lot of people that someone could be homosexual, even if they very much obviously were.
Actually, that goes back to the beginning. Let me just say this, that, you know, that Quentin Crisp, who, you know, was sort of a wonderfully colorful homosexual, wrote of those particular times, the late Edwardian era. Back in those days, a homosexual was somebody that you had probably never met, much less known. It was just all at a reserve, but not Mr. Bacon.
Yes. And Mark, this one of the things that I found absolutely compelling in the book is you know, and I think you both kind of referred to this already, but is this courage? You know, this is sometimes almost suicidal courage. You know, this sense that this fragile little boy, marginalized figure, physically ill, develops somewhere an extraordinary psychological courage, which is perhaps, you know, and the book seems to suggest this, that it's related to his sexuality as well, that because he takes or learns to take a certain kind of pleasure in pain, it perhaps is also fortifying in a way, because it means that as a person and as an artist, he's fundamentally not afraid of the darkest things, and that's what makes him the force that he will become.
Well, that's right. I mean, Lucian Freud thought he was the bravest man he'd ever met. I think when you feel that you've almost lost everything at an early point in your life, you perhaps become a risk taker, because what's to lose? You've already just about lost. He once said that, you know, we might the world is so meaningless that we might as well be extraordinary. What's to lose? And I think the sexuality, the sense of explosiveness, the sexual explosiveness, and the pain that's associated with sexuality was a meaningful way for him to address these kinds of issues. One thing we try to do in the book, though, is not interpret too much. You know, it's not to nail him down with how did he develop this courage. We hope to let the reader himself or herself get a sense of how that happened by just showing what he did and what he thought and what he said at different points, and then that builds together to the sensation that you can have of somebody who has this kind of courage. But we don't say it was because of this, or it was because of this, or it was because of this. You have to allow some air and mystery into a book. You have to biography. You can't pretend to know everything.
Oh, and that's what makes it so wonderful to read. Annalyn, one of the fascinations is this this period in Paris, you know, and again, I had absolutely no idea about his relationship with the great Eileen Gray, and of course another great Anglo-Irish figure, if you want to locate her there, and this sort of intended career as a designer. Why did that not come to fruition for him, and why did he want to obliterate it from the record?
Well, that's a very, very interesting two-part question. The first, to your first point, when Bacon was in Paris, he was very young, 17 and 18 years old. That was a time when, Montparnasse was ruled by Picasso and everybody else. They were still there, the great artist. It was very daunting for a young man like Francis Bacon, who really didn't have a lot of formal art training, to enter the art world. So what was he going to do? At this time, we really tried to bring this out in the book. At the time, Paris was as immersed in modern design and decoration as it was in painting. It was just another side of the coin. And Coco Chanel knew painters, and they knew, the people in the Eileen Gray, who of course studied both art and design. So it kind of was a natural segue if you stop to think about it. Somebody has artistic impulses. They're kind of awed and frightened by the world of Montparnasse. So what does he do? He goes into the other world, and it was eased by this wonderful Madge Garland character, who we brought up for the first time in the life of Francis Bacon. She had been the fashion editor at British Vogue. Dorothy Todd, her lover, Dorothy Todd was the editor. So the two of them kind of ruled the design and fashion world in London at the period just before Francis Bacon was going to France. At that very moment, Madge Garland had been fired, wound up in Paris. The whole world coalesced over there with sort of between English and French design. So she must surely have been the person who brought Eileen Gray and her Jean Désert showroom to his attention. And from there, it was Francis Bacon. One other thing that we bring out in the book, he was very, very good at making connections. You would never think that, but he knew where to go and what to do, and he could charm women. And so Madge Garland became this great enthusiast and is a force behind the show that you saw in the slideshow, his 1930 look. And to rate a 2-page opening spread of a story on the modern look and decoration written by Madge Garland in 1930, that would have been a wow. That would have just put all the other young designers back on their heels.
And yet, Mark, he abandons that side of himself, really, and it's not just that he doesn't become a famous designer, which is obvious. It's that he seems to be drawn away from technique, away from the sort of skill-based approach that he's developing as a designer. There's something about that seems fundamentally inadequate to him.
I think that's
right. Any sense of what it is?
Well, I mean, my own surmise is that, or guess, is that if you look at his later classically, famously messy studio, I think he thought that modern design of the kind that he was creating was a lie, that the room he was making a room that was very different from his room in Ireland, of course. He was making a new room, and he was trying to do that. That was a very serious matter to him, to create a new space for himself. But I think he determined that it was really not true. It didn't have enough animal. He liked a calfskin poof or two, and he tried to bring in some texture into his rooms. But that icy white modern feeling, that clarified feeling, he thought was just not true. So he needed to make another room. You earlier asked, why did he erase this design period from his life? And I think it's because he found it didn't fit with his own persona. He was very involved with creating a powerful persona, which is a very interesting creation that he made. It's not the whole truth of Bacon, but it's a very important aspect of Bacon. And the white room didn't really fit very well into that. And it wasn't classy enough. It suggested that he had to evolve like other people do. He wanted to seem as though he just was magically born. I think we say like Athena from the head of Zeus, flung free, that he never had to go through struggle and torment and evolution.
And let me just add to that, Fenton, because I did forget to say, why did he, work so hard to erase it? It was very interesting that in 1959, when he first went to the Marlborough Gallery, his very first CV, curriculum vitae, at the time said he did design jobs on the continent and in London. So there was one small whiff of a reference to it in the official biography, but of course, soon to be completely deep six, completely erased from the record. And, really, he would have done anything to keep this secret. The reason why we found the photograph is because very early on, the photograph of his design his design show at Queensberry Muse was because he made the mistake of sending the photograph and a press cutting to his mother. The mother loved Francis Bacon, adored him, despite everything he said. She kept it. And so when Mark went to South Africa to see Ianthe, the sister, lo and behold, there was this absolute physical evidence of Bacon's first, forgotten career.
Well, Bacon sent his mother some of his furniture, and she placed it in her bathroom.
Oh, wonderful. So, Mark, can we talk about the emergence of Bacon as the painter that we see? As you pointed out in the slides, it's not a straight line, really. You have that early crucifixion, and then you have this period of apparent obscurity, really, where his emerging fame as an artist seems to be kind of cut off, and he goes into this period of great isolation. What happens to him as a painter during those years, and in the late 1930s, early 1940s? What is it, or is there a thing you can put your finger on that actually is his moment of revelation about what it is that he can do that nobody else can do?
Well, I think one thing that happened to him is that he hit bottom. He had some early success, and then he had very significant failures. And I think he withdrew. We're in the book where we have to behave a bit like forensic detectives sometimes and pick out quotes from here, there, elsewhere, bits of letters. But we determined from that kind of investigation that he was working hard almost all this period. He didn't want anyone to know that he was working hard later, but he was by himself in his garret, in effect, trying new things again and again and again and again. And because he had so little formal art training, he was working out his own outlook, his own style, and his complete failure. I think he once said that he doesn't know if he would have been able to do what he did without the war. I think the war, the horror of the war, and especially the horror of London, which was cloaked and choked with dust, just a terrible thing for an asthmatic. The experience of London during the war and having to leave London because of the dust, I think his inner world and the outer world combined to say, oh, you just got to give it your shot. Who the hell cares? He was also very, very encouraged, we think, by the early Greek writers, the early Greek tragedians, especially Aeschylus, because he read a book by W.B. Stanford, a marvelous Irish writer of the period, who said that Aeschylus was this rough-hewn, imperfect, but powerful poet and dramatist, more so than perhaps Sophocles, who was smoother and more apparent and had training. And so Bacon said, well, okay, I can be broken, rude, angry. Why not? Right? It's something like that. But again, you don't want to presume too much.
Annalyn, around the same period, of course, you've got Samuel Beckett, who's in some ways a parallel figure. I mean, of course, also very different sensibility, but shaped by the war, but also this crisis in the idea of what is art, what purpose does it have, what function does it have? There's that famous Beckett quotation, which of course is about another painter. It's not about Bacon, but it's about painting, and he's talking about an art that is tired of being able. That this idea of expression has sort of run out of road in a way, and has to start again from not being able to do things, not being able to express, not knowing what to express, but yet having this obligation to express. Do you think that sort of parallel is also what's happening for Bacon in those years during the war and after the war?
Absolutely. So in that period when he was in Petersfield, in Steep, on the campus of Beatles School, he was alone there for about 2 years. We think that was a really important time. Almost no documentation exists, but we know that he was looking at picture post magazines of the Nazi leaders. He was very much taken by that sort of brutality of fact of the Nazis and the screaming mouths. And the paintings that led towards his famous three studies at the base of the Crucifixion, that there were the precursors of that were painted on the sort of wooden sundiala, right, Mark? So sundiala, but I'm trying to think of the word like picture board or post board or something. Those were, because canvas wasn't available. There you see these images of sort of Nazis with screaming mouths. Those kind of those were the first glimmerings that Bacon was turning towards the creature within as well as the creature without. And he was going probably where no other British painters were going, because in the 1945 show, why John Russell, the art critic John Russell, said people left the gallery reeling was because they had come in for comfort. They'd come in to see the Henry Moore, the Bunker drawings, and Graham Sutherland, the king of the neo-romantic art movement in England. And what they saw instead were these three ghoulish creatures, against this blazing orange background. So Bacon was almost single-handedly wrenching the British art scene out of that sort of neo-romantic pastoral tradition and into this fierce, truth-telling, no holes barred, savage vision of what 20th century life was really like. In other words, an existential vision with a capital E.
But Fintan, what you said about the relationship to Beckett is very interesting, about art having to begin again too. I think suddenly artists need some luck. And I think the luck of being an autodidact in that moment was quite strong. In other words, it was good not to have training suddenly. It was good not to know how to do it the old way, not to be too smooth. One of the criticisms that's often made of Bacon, well, the two main criticisms are, one, visually, he's not so good between figure and ground. I think he can be marvelous in his relationship between figure and ground, but there's a kind of a broken quality. Perhaps that's good. Perhaps that represents that the figure is no longer in stable relation to the environment, that the picture is not perfect in a way that's truthful. The other criticism made of him is that he was sort of grand guignol, kind of monstrous and a little bit campy. Well, perhaps the old subject matter wasn't work. Perhaps you needed now a feeling of too muchness. Maybe you needed to skirt vulgarity and to take that risk if you were going to do something new.
Yes. And Annalyn, one of the things that's really fascinating about him is that he eludes, you've got this, it's very crude, but it's a very basic kind of distinction between abstraction and figurative painting. And I think it's a phrase that is used in the book, actually talking about a very late painting, the Blood on the Pavement one, but making abstraction bleed, I think is a wonderful phrase that you both use there. And there is a lot of abstraction in a Beckett painting. It's very theatrical. Sometimes the spaces seem like bull rings or circus rings, or they're these kind of very odd performance spaces. and yet the blood is there. You know, the blood, both literally sometimes, but also figuratively. You know, the immediacy, the violence, the body, the inescapability is really what draws you in. So it must have been quite difficult for people to place him, because he creates his own relationship between what is abstract and what's figurative.
Yes, absolutely. But I think back again to the Grand Guignol that Mark just mentioned. That was upsetting enough for people because there was no point of reference. And then his going back and forth across that line, as you said, between abstract and figurative. He presented a lot of challenges to the art world, and people didn't really catch up to him for a very, very long time. I mean, it's probably after his death, that people have really come to acknowledge Francis Bacon's place on the world stage. He was more a character in a way, a creature, and everybody would point to the deficiencies in his painting without realizing that in the deficiencies there was strength. He made an asset of this kind of working between abstraction and figurative painting. The moment when Francis Bacon arguably was weaker was towards the end, we feel, when sometimes the figure and ground in those very late paintings just don't really work too well. He began spraying acrylic on the background and just kind of plunking a figure in front of it. So there is a lot of artists would agree that it didn't really cohere. I think Lucian Freud was a great critic of that as well. But if you look at the overall arc of Francis Bacon's career, that tension, that sort of primal tension between the inner self and the outer self, and abstract and figurative, really the unsettling mix is what gives his painting a lot of its power.
Can I just make a remark about that, which is that his the unstable sense of self, of physical self in his art from beginning to end, it's an evolution, and it changes, and it's different, and it can be quite amazing. In the early days, he had the feeling that he was trying to get to the absolute nerve, to find some physical central state. But as in those later paintings, for example, when he's using the acrylic and they're more soft, he begins to become a postmodernist, and you begin to think, well, where is the physical? Where the painting might be showing a moment of pain, but is it really painful, or are we seeing it through scrim and scrim and scrim? His earlier work, the way he's handling the paint. Where is the body? Where is the physical thing? So in his work as a whole, you can see this struggle to locate where the self might be, that I think is very important for the 20th century.
Yes. We've been talking about this sort of performative element, Annalyn, as well, of him. And one of the things that kind of comes across in the book is this sort of very complicated relationship between self-doubt on the one side and the creation of his own legend on the other side, right? So, he's extraordinarily adept socially. And this really is one of the most intriguing things in the book. Just how good he is at connection, at network, at career in a way. He's making his own legends, and he's playing up to it increasingly as he gets older. But does that mean that the self-doubt ever disappears?
Absolutely not. And in fact, they probably multiply toward the end of his life. I mean, that is one of the most fascinating themes that you just teased out of the book, because Bacon was, going back to that asthmatic childhood, the boy at the window, he was paralyzingly shy. And so his Oscar Wildean performance on the bigger stage, that was the presentation, and behind it was this often sort of quivering doubt. Obviously, a lot of us have this, right? We have our public face and our private face, but for him, the divide was just, it was an abyss between the two. And two things about that. One is no one ever knew the extent to which Bacon was sort of held together by little clips and safety pins, as it were, because he was massively dependent on drugs of every kind, from sedatives to psychotropic drugs, you name it. His doctors, first Dr. Stanley Brass and then Paul Brass, were essential to his life because he went to them every week and he got, the pills he needed, the injections he needed, and that kept him going, because a man who would drink till 3 or 4 in the morning and then have a couple 4 hours of sleep, maybe get up in the morning and try to work in his studio, that's a hard act, high wire act to keep going. But the last little sad note about this is his last lover, Jose Capello, who was a sort of marvelous Spanish gentleman, went with him to many events of the Sonia Orwell kind of dinner parties, those kind of things. And Bacon was always so fearful before he went to these events that he would write out questions for himself, that he would be sure to have some kind of entree into the conversation. And as Mark and I point out, in England, where so much rests upon one's education and that sort of nonchalance that you get by going to Eton and, the other public schools, Bacon was not of that world. I mean, he socialized in that world and he was dominant in that world in a sense, but yet underneath it all, he didn't have what they had, so he had to depend upon other things. The contradiction ran through his entire life till the very end in his death in Madrid. Yes.
Mark, it's difficult to sum him up really in terms of achievement. And you've both already made the point in a sense that it's almost like they're still grappling with what he did. How do you think he'll be seen in the history of art? I mean, is his reputation as the sort of the persona recedes, perhaps, and the ways in which your book, in a way, will change the way people think about him, because it makes him in a way more ordinary. He's still, of course, an extraordinary figure, but one of the very moving things you both show in the book is the degree to which actually what he wanted is, love and pleasure and things that everybody else wants. He's a human being after all. He's not this monster or this dandy or this rake. He's a very recognizable human being, and it seems to me the book will, in a way, sort of lay that ghost. It puts to bed that sort of all that things we need to know about his persona, and it brings us back in the end, which I think all great biographies of artists do, to the art. And I just wonder, where do you think the art will leave us?
One of the curious things about Bacon's art is, it is a marginal art. Many people just can't stand it. And that's all right. It's very odd, really, isn't it, that this very difficult artist who worked on the margins for a long time became so mainstream, became so celebrated and famous, and now his works sell for God knows how much money. It's very odd that this curious, dark character in the art, anyway, should have assumed that position. I think that in the future, there will be people who will always love him, but there will also be people who hate him. I think the century itself, and this is a large claim, I know, but I think once you've seen his work, you can't get it out of your eyes. Whether you like it or not, you recognize it. You say, this is not like anything I've seen before. It's sort of part of my mind. It's part of my sensibility. And it does that in the 20th century too, so that when people look back at 20th century art, they might say, oh, I don't like Bacon, or, oh, I love Bacon. But they will not be able to deny, I think, that you can't think of 20th century art without him, without this new kind of figure, human figure that he made, like it or not.
Just the last question, Annalyn, did you still like Bacon at the end of 10 years living with him?
Absolutely. I think for a writer, it is just a gift to have somebody that complicated, that you have to tease out this various strands to get to the person. And once you get closer and closer and closer, and then there's finally this element that you can only suppose, and that's the real person. So he remains in a way an unfinished, finally at the center, you don't want to go there as a biographer. You have to acknowledge that there's room for differences of opinion and perhaps is and what ifs. So what we hope to have done is both illuminate the man and the art, and also leave that quality, that sort of, the shimmering Bacon who's finally refuses to be pinned down. And that is so important to who he is and was.
Well, you've managed to I think capture him without pinning him down. It's and it's a wonderful achievement. I think even if you don't think you're particularly interested in Francis Bacon or in modern art, the book itself is just such an extraordinary pleasure. It's an adventure story, and it's utterly gripping. It just has that sort of energy of storytelling to it, which makes it a great book. And of course, that's the ultimate way of honoring a great artist, is to make a book that, in its own way, has the same kind of mastery that the artist was striving for. And I'm sure everybody will really get so much out of reading it. As I've got so much out of talking to you, it's been real pleasure, and I'm sure it's the same for all of the online audience.
Thank you so much, Fenton.
Thank you for joining us tonight. On screen, we are showing a slide with an image of the featured book jacket. The cover shows a close-up black and white photo portrait of Francis Bacon, who appears here as a middle-aged white man with medium-length salt and pepper hair brushed back from his face. He is wearing a ribbed turtleneck and leather jacket and gazing into the camera with a serious expression. On the left, there is a narrow vertical image running along the spine of the book that shows a glimpse of an artist's studio with paintbrushes in a bowl on a table. The text of the cover reads, Francis Bacon, Revelations, Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan, Pulitzer Prize-winning authors of De Kooning. Francis Bacon, Revelations is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shop-live. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The second slide contains live from NYPL upcoming events. Monday, April 19th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The Free World, Louis Menand with A.O. Scott, co-presented with the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. Tuesday, April 20th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I Am a Girl from Africa, Elizabeth Yamiyaro. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.